My name is Jonah Brucker-Cohen, and I'm an artist and Ph.D. candidate in the Disruptive Design Team at Trinity College, Dublin, in the Network and Communications Research Group, although I'm based in New York currently. And today I'm going to talk about my work as it pertains to the theme of deconstructing networks, and basically looking at how network interaction relates to kind of the subject. This symposium is a very good connection to that. So kind of moving to that, I wanted to start with this quote by Thomas Hyland Erickson. He says, "New technology cannot be used for anything at all, but it is also never known how it will be used. Technological changes, no matter how dazzling, are always put to use by particular societies with particular needs. They also bring subtle but often highly consequential side effects with them." And I think it's a really interesting quote because it basically examines the tension between new technologies and their intended use and how different our eventual use ends up being. So getting into my own research, I wanted to start off with sort of the importance of networked objects, what I see as opportunities and dilemmas surrounding that. So start off with some opportunities. The first one is I see network objects as a way of creating perceptual shifts in how people perceive themselves in relation to objects and the environment, kind of allowing you to see kind of a different perspective on things related to a larger theme. Also, network objects allow connections between simultaneous visitors to online spaces and the physical spaces they represent. For instance, there might be a lot of people visiting this location's website right now, but how do we actually connect to them? So network objects could facilitate this. As far as dilemmas of networked objects, the first one I'd say would be information overload, because basically I think that the more kind of information coming into a system, it basically kind of creates a type of diversion when you have a real specific focus. So basically, there's a quote here that I like by David Schenck that looks at the idea of information overload from his book Data Smog. He says, "Just as fat has replaced starvation as the U.S. #1 dietary concern, information overload has replaced information scarcity as an important new emotional, social, and political problem." And I think that's really interesting because it kind of shows how as we have all these connected objects, information tends to kind of overshadow what the actual point of having them in the first place was. So here's an example of a product. It's called the RSS Room Reader. It prints RSS feeds on toilet paper and basically allows you to kind of read your news feeds as you're going to the bathroom. But I thought that was an interesting example of a project that kind of looks at information overload, and eventually it gets to the point where we'll have so much information we'll just end up printing it on our toilet paper. So yeah. So my work itself looks at the idea of subverting network context. This is an earlier project I did called Internet Radio that looks at the idea of displacing information context. When you put something like internet radio into a vintage radio, something that your grandmother understands, how does that actually change the interface dynamic between networks and people? I'm going to be looking at 4 examples. The first is network consequences. What happens when you add a physical consequence to something like visiting a website? As banal as that may seem, how do you actually create some type of physical connection? Also, social subversion. When you take a existing social network and you add a structural shift or something in the social dynamic that changes, how does that actually create a difference of interactivity? Also, I'll be looking at networks of coincidence, how you could socialize public space by creating a moment of coincidence, which then allows people in a space to be connected some way. And then finally, I'm going to get into the idea of wireless control and the rules of public wireless space, which is something that we're really seeing now as more and more networks are popping up in urban spaces. And so I've been working in that context. So to start off, I'll talk about network consequence. This was a project that I built called Alerting Infrastructure, and basically consisted of this large jackhammer that was against the wall of a building, and then that building's website was actually connected to this, so anytime someone visited the website of that building, this jackhammer would go off and start destroying the walls. So it's really examining the questions of how a website relates to the physical space it represents, right? How do you actually connect people in those spaces? How can simultaneous visitors to online and real spaces interact? And are there consequences? Because we don't necessarily think of visiting a website as something that could actually be consequential. So here's a quick 1-minute video about this project. Hopefully there'll be sound. Yeah. So I set this up initially in Dublin at an art center. And then as visitors to the site would see something like this. Yeah, so over time, that project would basically create an interesting mess on the floor. So finally, moving on from that, I wanted to get into the idea of social subversion and what happens when you take a system that people are very used to using and change a really simple rule. So this was a project that I did called Bump List that looked at email lists. Now, everyone in this room is probably on an email list or has been on an email list. And basically what Bump List did was it created a situation where only 6 people can be a part of this list. And when a new person joins the list, it bumps off the first. So in order to be part of this, you have to continually subscribe. And we had a really interesting situation where people were being bumped at the course of like a few seconds, actually. So it ended up being kind of an email form of chat because they had to type so fast before they were bumped. So it's looking at imposed rule sets, how that forces people to invent new forms of interaction in order to communicate with each other, because we had people who were so upset they were being bumped all the time, they actually started a Yahoo Groups list for people that were bumped so they could keep talking. And just interesting ways of kind of getting stats and stuff out. So it's really kind of neat to see how people go outside the boundaries of a system to create their own system once it's there. It shifts dynamics of interaction in this case, and how does that create new understandings of how a medium is used or could be used, and why do we kind of have these set rules going on for systems? In this case, it's appropriating an existing system to alter notions of what an online community is or could be. And I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of the times we just kind of take things for as they are, and we don't really kind of question this built environment and how we can actually move to the next stage. And there's just a screenshot. You can see at the top, it had a lot of total subscribes. I think totally it was probably a couple, 200,000. And some of those are, people resubscribing. And then there was no archive, so they just kind of could see a few messages that were being sent. And then I built this into a router, basically, so it looks at physical spaces as well. And so it's the same system. When you join the wireless network, you bump people off who are sitting in the same space that you're in. So you kind of get this really interesting dynamic of physical interaction as it goes to a networked interaction. So moving on from that, I've also been looking at the idea of networks of coincidence and kind of how coincidental occurrences can cause networked communication in physical space. This is a project called UmbrellaNet that I collaborated on with Catherine Moriwaki. And basically, this was a series of 10 umbrellas that are connected over a wireless ad hoc network. And they communicate through multi-hop dynamic routing. So basically, when it rains and you open your umbrella, this instant network would form between people in a co-located area. And then you could swap data through these PDAs that were there. So UmbrellaNet's looking at how do coincidental and collective experiences connect people in urban spaces. So this network would only form when it rains, and when it stops raining, you put your umbrellas down and the network's gone. So it's really examining this idea of kind of a very fast deployed network that exists based on physical co-location. And it's a multi-hop ad hoc network, so it hops between people who are connected, and it's looking at the social applications of multi-hop ad hoc networks in general and how you could actually envision that on a physical space. And in this particular, the umbrellas would light up when they were connected, so they would be blue when they were connected and red when they were not. So it's looking at how do you visualize networks in public spaces. Yeah. So here's just a picture of kind of the visualization of what it looked like on a city street. And you have appearance layers that illustrate ad hoc network formation during moments of coincidence. Those are type of conceptual models. And then applications of this might be doing something like sharing a location-based map, chat relay, music sharing, those kind of things that basically exist between co-located people. So finally, I just want to talk about the last project, which is Wi-Fi Hog, and it's looking at the idea of wireless control. So here's a picture of like a public park, right? And you have all of these red beacons, which are wireless signals being broadcast out into the park, and they're all branded. So you have over there Verizon, Boingo, who used to like supply for hotels, McDonald's has them, Starbucks has them. And you're having these clashes in public spaces where all of these broadcast signals are going out. And there was in 2000, a free community group network had to shut down because Starbucks had a much more powerful beacon that was shutting down their network. And so it actually caused the free network to shut down while the pay one went up. So I built a project called Wi-Fi Hog that looked at this, and this was a portable video jammer connected to a laptop, and some packet sniffing software. So when you join the network, it actually only allows packets that from your computer to get through the network, and if it sees packets coming from other computers, it turns this jammer on and jams the entire network. So basically, it's a way of kind of allowing control to come from a third party. And it's also kind of examining these questions of what the acceptable use policy of public wireless is. How do you is there one? There isn't one now, but should there be one since these clashes are occurring? And according to Jürgen Habermas, who talks about public sphere, is the promise of the public sphere as a social level or really relevant in wireless networks? Because you have all these clashes between commercial, non-commercial, community groups, these kind of things. And in the case of this project, how does social obstruction of shared resources alter claims of ownership in public space, right? Because you have people claiming ownership over space that really isn't theirs to own. It's just whatever their signal can cover. So how do they actually create a type of community or community space in there? So just to conclude, just wanted to bring up a couple points. First idea is shifting methods of network representation experience by amplifying metaphors and connectivity cliches, like in some of these projects, allows for a critical analysis of common methodologies, and that in particular has to do relates back to bump lists, for instance, and BumpNet, looking at how when you add these when you amplify these metaphors of connectivity, you can really see the kind of base of these network connections and how people are connecting. And then finally, deconstructing networks has implications for the evolving relations between people and things by altering these perceived relationships to provide alternative scenarios for use and operation. So kind of looking at how there's different types of methods for connection and by deconstructing the existing ones that exist. So anyway, that's it for me. Thanks.